Then I'd say we start off. Thank you everyone for joining today. So today the topic is going to be digits, grasp digits, the interplay of fingers and numbers in early numerical development. We're going to have 4 presentations, trying to have each presentation roughly at 10 minutes. If there are some clarification questions in between, just say hello in the chat or speak up. We will have the main discussion at the end. We're gonna start with Amandine van Rinsveld, followed by Ursula Fischer, then Roberta Barrocas, and finally Firat Soylu, and we'll present some of his work. So Amandine, if you wanna go ahead.
Thanks. I will just share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. So this is the first presentation of this symposium. So, sorry. So, as you know, fingers have been associated with the development of numerical skills and later mathematical achievement, with the idea that fingers are touchable supports to represent numbers or to hold on the count. And some authors even suggested to integrate finger-based representation at different levels of existing models of numerical development. And finger-related skills, especially finger gnosis, have been considered as a potential predictor of numerical learning. But evidence is also mixed in the literature about the predictive power of fingers in numerical cognition, and potentially because from one study to another, very different kinds of finger-related skills are put in relation to numerical development. So when you look closer at it, fingers are not only a support for numerical cognition, they are also a part of the body that does not involve only cognitive aspects, of course, but also sensory motor aspects that may have their own developmental trajectory. And therefore, we wanted to contrast 2 different aspects of fingers that could influence numerical development in the same individuals. At one end, finger gnosis, and which is the ability to distinguish one's own fingers. And at the other end, the visual recognition of finger patterns, as you can see here. With this main question, are finger gnosis or visual representation of numbers as finger configurations, or both, equally related to the development of numerical representations? So we tested this in a longitudinal setting where children were tested twice, the first time in the middle of kindergarten and the second time after 2 or 3 months of first year of primary school, resulting in a 9-month gap in between both testing times, where we assumed that their numerical skills developed a lot during that time window. So children performed a number 2 position number line task at both time points with different range of numbers. And at T1, we assessed them on finger-related skills, finger gnosis and finger run. I will explain what it is in a minute. And we also had a control counting task at T1. So for the finger gnosis task, this one consisted in recognizing which finger is touched by the experimenter with the hand hidden behind the cardboard. So this is a classical procedure that has been used very frequently in the literature. And for the visual recognition of finger patterns, we used a more custom task, which we named finger rapid automatized naming. So the principle of rapid automatized naming is to name items as fast as possible. And here, in this case, the items, it's visual configuration of fingers that the children had to name as fast as possible. So for the results, at both measurement points, first only counting and the finger-related skills at T1, we found that there was a correlation between finger run and counting, and between finger gnosis and run, but not between counting and finger gnosis. This is the first result. And then a second one, at both measurement points, number line estimations correlated with counting skills and with finger run, but again, not with finger gnosis. Actually, in the whole study, finger gnosis did not correlate with any other variable but finger run. So this is the first result from the correlation. Then we ran a stepwise regression analysis to examine what is the unique contribution of each variable to predict number line estimation 1 year later. And adding finger gnosis to the model, did not improve the model, but adding finger run did over counting. And then we wanted to measure the role of finger run as a mediator between counting and later numerical representation. So we ran a mediation analysis. So this is the first model from the mediation without the mediator, a simple regression showing that counting predicts number line estimation 1 year later. And this is when we added finger run as the mediator in the model. And here you can see that we only had a remaining indirect effect between counting and number line estimation through this finger. And no direct effect anymore. So there was a full mediation here. So to sum up, the finger run uniquely predicted number line estimation 1 year later, and finger run and finger gnosis were correlated with each other, but finger gnosis did not predict any variance in number line estimation. It was only correlated with finger run. So the current study highlights that the visual representation of numbers as fingers could help to develop accurate numerical representation. And previous studies have reported inconsistent results regarding the relation between finger knowledge in general and numerical representation. And the argument here is that a potential source of such inconsistency could come from this various range of finger-related tasks chosen in different studies, because as you can see here, even in the same individuals using two different finger tasks, tackling different aspects of fingers is differently related to numerical representations. And also, especially about, I will discuss a bit more, why did we not find a relation between finger gnosis and numerical tasks? Maybe because finger gnosis, as we evaluated here, is more a general sensory identification task that has nothing to do with numbers in the task in itself. So two important factors must be considered regarding finger gnosis. So first, the way it is evaluated, as I said, and then another factor is age, because there are a few studies that evaluated finger gnosis in a similar way as we did, without any numerical load, and still showing a link between numerical skills and finger gnosis, but all those studies were done in older children. Here we had 5 years kindergartners, so it might be that tactile locations are not fully mature at that age, and that identifying one's own finger may become more accurate over time because it has its own developmental trajectory. And also potentially, but this is more a hypothesis, also it's possible that tactile locations become more accurate with numerical learning when fingers are used for numbers, but this will need to be tested in the future, of course. So the visual recognition of fingers, to come back to that as patterns, may be a mark of this transition between non-symbolic and symbolic numerical quantity abstraction. The visual finger patterns especially could work as an additional visual code that is intuitive and analogic to discrete quantities, and that would ensure an optimal transition to symbols for numbers. So fingers are an easy way to visualize quantities in an analogic way, at least at 5-year-olds, as we tested here. So to conclude, the current studies highlights this link between visual pattern recognition and accurate number representations 1 year later. We had no evidence, similar evidence in favor of finger gnosis, as we didn't find any correlation with other measures except finger run. So here we provide evidence that visual patterns may help to establish accurate symbolic number representations over time, and but this does not preclude the fact that fingers may support different functions at different stages. It remains possible that finger gnosis support other aspects of numerical learning at later stages in older children, for instance. So this is the very first study that directly compared different kinds of finger skills in the same individuals. And of course, this will need to be replicated and assessed in different age groups in the future. So, yeah. So this is the last slide, just to say that this study is already went already out earlier this year. So if you want to see it, there is a link here in this slide. And yeah, so this is also the opportunity to thank my co-authors on this study, and thank you for your attention. And I hope you have questions.
Thank you very much, Amandine. Very interesting study. So we have 2 quick questions, I suppose. First one is from Christoph.
Hi, a very nice study. I have just like one question about, so to say, like discriminant validity of this finger run task. So do you have any measure that could show that it's not about just whatever naming numbers in any visual stimuli, let's say like dice patterns or some just scattered dots, and then just like doing things quickly, like information processing speed, which is not strictly related to really recognizing the patterns like this or whatever else?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the question. I see what you mean, and it's actually exactly a question we had in the reviewing process of this paper. So
not me.
I don't know if it was you, and actually no. We didn't test it on those kids here. We didn't ask them to do a speed test or dices or stuff like this, but we were kind of assuming it was not, because there was this finger run. It's not the very first time it's used. It was already used in 2 other studies before, where they contrasted dice runs and speed processing and so on. And they showed that there was really something specific with this finger run, some variance that was not commonly captured in this task than in dice run, or I think it was a classical picture naming run, and there was also letter run, if I remember well. And there was really some specific variance in this finger run that was not common to the other run tasks. But I agree that I didn't test it on those individuals from this study here. Yeah, unfortunately.
Thanks.
Okay, Martin.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for this interesting talk. I'm also interested in details about the finger run, because I just didn't know about it before. Two details I would like to ask. First, whether a particular finger posture was shown both for the left and the right hand. you know, starting on the right with number 2 or left number 2. And secondly, whether the performance is just a total score of how many postures are correctly named, or whether there is some other computation that includes also the errors or the deviation from the correct answer.
Yes, thank you. So for your first question, yes, there was only right hands, and we only included the right-handed participant in this sample because we had too few left-hander, 6 or 7 if I remember well, so we dropped them out. So the finger configuration that were shown were only right hands, and they were also configured in a way, I think it's with one starting here, right, and then 2, 3, and it's supposed to be matched to the kits that were tested here. So the kits tested here were French, and this is how they learn to count on their fingers, starting with this finger. So this is for your first question. And then for the second one, yes, we did compute a combined measure between how many configurations they recognized correctly and the time they took to do it. Yes, it was a combined measure of both.
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, Martha, I think your question is somehow answered, is it? As there were only canonical finger patterns.
Only canonical, yes.
Please speak up if there's anything else you would like to know.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering if those are ones they're used in counting. Are they also the ones you would use if you were saying, I have 3 of something, or if you were using them as a cardinal number gesture? Like sometimes we count differently, like we enumerate differently than we might represent a quantity, yeah.
I see what you mean, but I'm sure that I think that's I'm not sure how they how the match was between how they show when they showed 3, for instance, if they show 3 like this or like this is something
right.
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Then I think we should go ahead with our next presenter, which is Ursula Fischer.
All right, I just shared my screen. Can you all see it?
So far it's black.
Still processing, okay.
Yes, now it's up, yeah.
It's up, okay, perfect. Then, hi everyone. I'm going to today be presenting to you a study in which I investigated how fine motor skills and finger gnosis might contribute to preschool children's numerical competencies. And my interest in this topic has arisen from my interest in fine motor skills. So in the previous couple of years, I've done a couple of studies on fine motor skills and their association with numerical skills. And there have been a number of studies on this connection, and most of those studies really report that there's a significant association between fine motor skills and numerical skills, but most studies have not really gone into why that is. And me and my co-authors followed up the hypothesis that it might just be because children count and calculate on their fingers when they're really young, there might be a functional connection. So fine motor skills might just be necessary when children learn to count on their fingers. They have to be able to move their fingers one by one, and they have to be able to manipulate them in a way. And that might be why we have those results. And we've done a couple of studies on this issue, and specifically we found associations with counting, but we've also found associations of fine motor skills with finger counting specifically. And in those studies we've done, for example, we found that finger-based numerical skills were more strongly associated with fine motor skills than non-finger-based numerical skills. We've done a study in which we compared different facets of fine motor skills, and here we found that those fine motor skills that are not graphomotor, so that do not involve a pen and a paper, are more strongly related to numerical skills, which we interpreted to mean that it might be functional. So those fine motor skills that we need for finger counting, that is agility, so we need to be able to move our fingers one by one, not all of them at once and not uncoordinated. And dexterity, which is also sometimes measured via object manipulation, and that might be relevant when we count objects, for example. And we found that this relationship might be mediated via finger counting and also finger monitoring, which is what we've already talked about. So finger counting would be counting one by one on your fingers. I'm showing it in German, but it could also be like this. And finger monitoring would be, we tell children to please show us a number with their fingers, and children would go like this simultaneously. That would be finger monitoring. And those, in our study at least, mediated the association of fine motor skills with numerical skills. But one thing that we really haven't looked into is how this is all related to finger noses. So we really haven't looked into it, and we were really interested in whether or not finger noses might, for example, be something that precedes fine motor skills. So it's very possible that finger noses is relevant when we develop fine motor skills, and we need to know where our fingers are, and we need to be able to represent them in order to even move them separately. And that might be a mechanism that could possibly explain our findings. But it's also possible that those mechanisms are different and that they might each contribute individually and separately, independently to numerical skills. And this is what we looked at here. In this current study, we included a number of tasks. The first one being, of course, finger noses, and this one was non-motoric, so children could respond completely without moving their fingers, and that was very important in order for us to keep this separate from the fine motor skills. And then use two tasks for fine motor skills, the one being the finger agility, which was just children had to tap single fingers onto the table without actually moving other fingers or moving the wrong finger, and a dexterity subscale that measured bead threading and coin posting, and also a tracing task that was from a standardized test battery. For numerical skills, we then again used our finger counting and monitoring tasks in the range of 1 to 10. So we asked children to count to a certain number on their fingers or to show us a certain number on their fingers, and we did all the numbers from 1 to 10. We then had a picture-based calculation task that was very simple addition and subtraction items. So children were shown 5 balloons, 2 of them were red and 2 of them were blue, and 3 of them were blue. And they were asked how many are 2 plus 3 balloons. Most children solved this via counting. I have to say that in advanced, children didn't really actually add and subtract in the way that we would assume. And we also included a number line estimation task in the range from 0 to 10 that was symbolic on a piece of paper. Because many previous studies have found associations between working memory and reasoning and numerical skills, we've also included those two as control variables in all our analysis. We did a complete within subject design, so all the children completed the same tasks. It was actually correlational, so we unfortunately don't have longitudinal data, but children were 5 years, 5 months on average with a rather large age range. And the first thing I want to show you is actually my partial correlation. So when I correlated everything, I found that working memory, reasoning, and age were actually correlated with all of my dependent and independent variables. So I partialed all of them out for the correlation already to be really strict with my data. And so what we found, unfortunately, in this first analysis already was that finger agility and dexterity were no longer associated significantly with finger gnosis. So we can't actually do a model on those because they seem to be unrelated, at least in this data set, when I control for all my control variables. But interestingly enough, all 3 of them correlated with some of my numerical measures. So for finger counting, all 3 aspects of finger agility, dexterity, and finger gnosis correlated. For finger monitoring, finger agility didn't. And for calculation, finger dexterity didn't. What's also interesting, but I'm actually really happy that Amandine finds something similar. I did not find an association with number line estimation tasks. So there was no association with either of my variables of interest. And so I did no further analysis on this task. In the next step, I tried to put all my predictors into regression models. And here I calculated hierarchical models for each of the 3 numerical skill measures, which looked something like this. So in the first step, I'm going to guide you through this. In the first step, I entered my control variables again, just to make sure that I actually explain variance. And so for finger counting, all three control variables contributed significantly to the model, for finger monitoring as well. And for calculation, everything but reasoning also contributed significantly in the first step. So it's important that I put this in. And then in the second step, I now added first the fine motor skills, so finger agility and dexterity. And here, as you can see, they significantly increase the explained variance for finger counting. So here I have a significant effect of both finger agility and dexterity. For finger monitoring, it's just dexterity. And for calculation, it's only finger agility. So there seems to be, there is an association, but it's different depending on what numerical skill I measure. And what's more interesting is when I then add finger gnosis on top of it, it's significant only for finger monitoring. So it adds significant variance for finger monitoring, which is really unexpected. And I had to think long and hard about how I'm going to interpret those results, but I'm going to try. So this is kind of the pattern of what I found. So I found that finger agility was predictive of finger counting and calculation. Dexterity was related to finger counting, and finger gnosis was related to finger monitoring. So first conclusion is that it seems that fine motor skills and finger gnosis are associated with numerical skills, but with different ones, not in equal measure, not at the same time, and they do not seem to interact. And I tried interactions, it really didn't work. I found no significant interactions of any of those predictors. And it's very possible that in this particular case, fine motor skills might be relevant for those tasks where children count. And that is how they solved the calculation task, if you remember. So I have the finger agility that might be relevant for both finger counting and then maybe even for the calculation procedures, because children did take out their hands, counted out the balloons, or counted them out on paper. And that might be why they needed fine motor skills for this. And it's very possible that finger monitoring is something where you have to call upon a representation. So you might have to represent your fingers or your finger constellation. You have to be aware of what your fingers look like when you put them out at once. And children did do that. So children did not solve this task by going. But when I told them to show me 3 fingers, they usually went like this if they already knew how the number 3 looked, or otherwise they just didn't respond. So it seems that they're capable of that, but they might have to draw upon a representation of some form. And that is why I have those diverging results. But what I have to consider for future studies is that I probably need to look into this a little bit more. We have this problem that when we do finger counting and monitoring tasks, that the older children are almost always at ceiling. So this was also the case in our study. We didn't have overall ceiling effects, but just looking at the older kids, we couldn't really do anything with the data anymore. So it would be interesting to look at younger children in this particular case, and also compare the finger gnosis task that we used with one that maybe has a motor component, to see if that's the reason that what we find is not exactly what previous studies have reported on finger gnosis and fine motor skills. And of course, it would be super interesting to do longitudinal design, which so far we haven't gotten around to doing, but really seeing how children develop and how this then transfers into school and into more complex mathematical skills, which we just couldn't measure with a kindergarten sample. So that's it from me. I'm very open for suggestions or interpretations of my data because I'm still in the middle of analyzing them. But thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ursi. Are there any quick questions? Yes, Amandine.
Fast, very, very fast. How old were the children here?
Sorry, they were on average 5 years and 5 months, but it ranged from 3 years, 11 months to 6 years and 9 months. So it was really a large age range. And it would really pay off to just have maybe a smaller group, but then have it really more focused. And then I could also adapt the difficulty of the tasks. So in this study, we needed to find tasks that all of them could do, and that was a little bit difficult. But yeah, it was a little bit too large. That's why originally I tried to form age groups, but that didn't really work out.
And did you try to put, I don't know if it's possible, but to put age somehow as a noise variable in some maybe smaller models than the big one, your big one?
I have tried simple slopes analysis for some specific associations, but haven't really found anything that I could interpret. That was the problem. But maybe those were the ceiling effects of the older children that were really problematic here.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So then we go ahead with Roberta, if you want to share your screen.
Oh, wait a second, I was muted. Can you all hear me now? Hi everyone, my name is Roberta Barrocas. I'm a PhD student at the Leibniz-Institut for Wissensmedien in Germany, and today I would like to talk to you about cognitive and sensory motor influences on preschool numerical abilities. Fingers and numbers seem to be inextricably associated. For example, people from almost all cultures seem to be using their fingers for counting. Even adults may resort to finger counting in certain conditions. This association can be observed in many ways. For example, on a behavioral level, finger sensory motor skills have been found to predict numerical abilities in preschool children. Furthermore, number magnitude processing has been shown to be facilitated by either observing or reproducing canonical finger patterns. That is, the mere act of stretching out 3 fingers helps you understand the notion of 3 better. Fingers were also shown to be associated with specific fingers and that people are faster to identify, for example, Arabic digits through a key press when they do so with the finger that they use to count to that specific number. So taken together, there's a lot of evidence on the association of fingers and numbers. However, there are still some questions that remain open. For example, one of them is, do finger sensory motor skills predict numerical abilities beyond the influence of domain general variables? Or is the association of fingers and numbers just a consequence of a general maturation factor which drives the development of both variables? Second question is, where does this association come from? So I'll try to address these 2 questions briefly in 2 steps. First, I will present a study that we already published recently. It's a literature review, and then I'm going to talk about some preliminary findings from one cross-sectional study that we ran with kindergarten children. So the first study that I'm going to talk about is the literature review about the influence of finger gnosis and fine motor skills on numerical abilities in preschool age. I'm not going to explain the concepts to you because they have already been explained by our previous presenters. So in sum, our findings were that both finger gnosis and fine motor skills were able to predict measures of counting, number knowledge, calculation, and magnitude processing. And they did so both concurrently and also longitudinally. Most of the effects that we found were small effect sizes, but 5 of the 19 studies that we reviewed also found medium to large effect sizes. However, one issue that we encountered when we reviewed these studies is that both of the studies, especially the ones investigating fine motor skills, used a composite measure of numerical skills as dependent variable. And as is the case mostly for the large-scale studies about fine motor skills, they used a math achievement score as a dependent variable, and thus we don't get from these studies a clear view on what is happening, on what the specific associations of finger movements and finger sensory aspects are with numerical skills. In addition to that, by means of a P-curve analysis, we found that the findings reporting an association of finger gnosis and fine motor skills with numerical skills contain evidential value. That is, these findings are replicable and they do not reflect a false positive effect. However, this association may be less pronounced than previously thought. So as I said before, the effect sizes of these studies were mostly small. And finally, what we also do in this review is we propose an integrative framework in which we combine functional and redeployment mechanisms into one framework that explains where the association of fingers and numbers come from. So next I would like to talk about a second study that is work in progress, in which we address the question whether finger sensory motor skills predict numerical skills beyond the influence of domain general variables, such as general cognitive ability and visual spatial working memory. To this end, we consider the influence of these variables across 3 levels of numerical development as proposed in the model of Roche-Müller 2015, which is based on the model of Krajewski and Schneider 2009. And according to this model, the 3 levels of numerical abilities, which are not necessarily stages, so they may happen concomitantly. On the first level, children learn how to count, so they learn the exact number word sequence and some counting principles such as one-to-one correspondence and stable order. And on the second level, children acquire the notion of cardinality, so they learn how to map the magnitude onto their respective number words, and they also learn how to map magnitudes into Arabic digits. And some side notions that they also acquire on this level are, for example, the successor function and the notion of equinumerosity. And on the third level, children learn part-whole relations, which is number composition and decomposition. And in this stage, they learn how to perform initial calculations. So part-whole relations are usually considered a necessary step for the acquisition of arithmetic skills. And in order to keep our testing consistent with the theoretical framework that we use in our study, we tested children with a standardized test called MBK0, which was developed by the same authors of the theoretical model. So on the first glance, we can see that children's performance seems to increase more or less steadily and more or less in a linear way across age groups. So from ages 4 to 6.5, there seems to be specifically one leap between ages 5.5 and 6 in visual spatial working memory. Apart from that, we can also see, for example, that here in the finger gnosis task, which is represented by the blue dot, the increase doesn't seem to be very important, but it's probably due to the fact that we did not have a lot of items on that task. Second, we ran an ANOVA with age groups as independent variable and with numerical skills, so the general score of numerical skills as the independent variable. And we also included our variables of interest, which are the finger sensory motor variables, as covariates. And we found a significant main effect of age only, so there was no effect of the finger sensory motor variables on numerical skills, and there were no significant interactions. All pairwise comparisons were significantly different, so older children scored significantly better than middle children and younger children on level 1, and the same happened on all the other levels, and middle children performed better than younger children, also on all levels. So by now we already know that age is a very important factor in explaining variance in data. But what we want to know here is whether finger sensory motor skills are able to explain additional variance in this data. So to explore this question, we ran a 3-step hierarchical regression analysis with age as an independent variable on the first step. And as we can see, age alone explained 56% variance. On step 2, we added our domain general variables, so cognitive ability, general cognitive ability, as well as visual spatial working memory, which we assessed by means of the backward span of Corsi. And again, this inclusion was significant, and it explained 5% more variance. On step 3, we added the finger variables, and this inclusion explained 3% more variance, with the only significant predictors in step 3 being general cognitive ability and finger tapping. Next, because we were interested in the influence on numerical skills across different levels of numerical abilities, according to the model that we explained, we reran the same analysis, but this time with performance on level 1 as dependent variable. And again, here we see that age alone explains a lot of variance, so 46% on step 1. On step 2, we add again our domain general variables, and we can explain 2% more variance. This was also significant, but this time the inclusion of the finger sensory motor variables did not actually generate a significant improvement to the model, even though we could explain 5% more variance. And again, here we see that general cognitive ability as well as finger tapping are the only significant predictors that we entered in step 3. On level 2, which is cardinality, we could explain 55% variance with age alone. With the addition of the domain general variables, we could explain 2% more variance again. And the inclusion of our finger sensory motor variables in step 3 explained 1% more variance, but this was significant. But this time we don't see any individual significant predictor when we contemplate the coefficients. And then on level 3, only the addition of the domain general variables contributed something to the explanation of the variance in the data. So the inclusion of our finger sensory motor skills actually did not explain any more variance than what we already had in the model to begin with. So as I said before, the results of the second study that I presented are rather preliminary, so I don't want to get ahead of myself in interpreting the findings. But what I would like to say as a concluding remark is that fingers are relevant for the development of numerical skills, but maybe not for everyone, not for every age, and not for every numerical skill. And the second question that I would like to raise is, should we be looking not into if finger sensory motor skills are relevant for numerical skills, but how these skills influence the use of finger-based strategies, and how these in turn influence numerical skills. So does it really matter if you have good finger gnosis and good fine motor skills if you don't actually transfer these skills into handling numerical tasks with your fingers in a sensible way? And finally, I would just like to give a little teaser of one longitudinal study that we are conducting and writing up in collaboration with the UMIT Halle in Tirol, in which we tested 55 preschoolers and measures of finger pattern recognition, finger monitoring, cardinality task, which is an adaptation of the given number task, and knowledge of quantifiers. And we found that finger monitoring in TU was the only significant predictor of cardinality knowledge in T2. And this above and beyond the influence of vocabulary, which we used as a proxy for general cognitive development, and concurrent performance in the cardinality task. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions, remarks, and feedback.
Sorry for this.
Hi everyone. So I will make this quick as possible. So it's great that I have a chance to talk after the previous three speakers, because I think some of the things that I will talk about will relate to the data that they presented. So,
just quick mentioning, so we're not seeing the full screen. We also see, I think, your presenter's view.
Oh, okay, let me stop sharing and share again. Share. Okay, sorry about that.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, so okay, so I'm interested in fingers and math, obviously, and there are all these set of questions, and the previous speakers talked about some of these questions. They're very extensive, and there has been a lot of research on fingers and math in the, perhaps particularly the last 10, 15 years. And one problem that I have is, as someone studying this relation, is to situate the findings on finger math in existing numerical cognition models. So often when we do research, we analyze the data and then we have our findings, and then we have to situate these findings in the existing literature, the dominant models in the field. And I often have problems doing that because I come from a more embodied cognition perspective, but it is sometimes hard to even situate the findings within that framework. So I have this theoretical problem. Where do all of these findings on finger math go in numerical cognition? That's essentially the problem that I'm having. So this is, this reminds me of just walking in a room with a blindfold. So you kind of get a sense of the things, but you don't really see where all this research and data goes. So I have done studies on finger noses, finger tapping, you know, ERP and fMRI studies, and structural studies. But again, every time I have this problem of, where does this go in the numerical cognition research, in the wider numerical cognition research, because it sometimes feels like finger math research is a silo itself, and you don't see that being really having an impact on the dominant models. So there are all these set of open questions about how the finger sensor motor system participates in number processing. And I'm particularly referring to neural explanations on number processing, and then questions about counting, arithmetic, number sense, and then you have a set of different set of finger measures, gnosis, tapping, fine motor skills, visual perception of canonical versus monitoring finger numeral configurations, and all of these things. All right, so when I look at recent meta-analysis studies in numerical cognition, I don't see fingers much in those meta-analysis. It is not in the models that are produced at the end of the analysis, but also the studies that are covered also don't involve neuroimaging studies that have fingers in them. And this is part of the issue, because when you analyze your data and try to situate your findings in existing models, you refer to these meta-analysis studies or studies that develop models. And we kind of tend to have this more kind of cognitivist orientation in these models. And maybe there's no other way around, right? I mean, maybe we don't know enough about fingers yet to, the finger sensor motor system and how it is associated with other systems that participate in number processing. So maybe there's difficulty. But since now I have the chance to talk to a large group of mathematical cognition researchers, I'm here to kind of present this idea that perhaps we should think about not only the finger sensory motor system, but in general the sensory motor system, and bodily interactions associated with them can be part of these models that we have. So I rely on both evolutionary and embodied cognition approaches, but the landscape there is not very clear, right? Because you don't have just a single evolutionary theory, or embodied cognition is an ocean with many different ideas in it. So I've been going through this journey of kind of trying to provide embodied explanations for these findings, but even the explanations that I kind of come up maybe don't really fit to the understanding of embodied cognition that I have. I mean, what I mean is, when you talk about embodied cognition, you have these different types of theories, right? So I'm just overgeneralizing here, but you have distributed extended cognition theories, which there the idea is that the environment is part of the context, again, simplifying. And then we have what some people call weak embodied cognition, where we have these sensory motor simulation ideas, right? So the idea there is that bodily interactions are presented as sensory motor simulations, and they might participate in cognitive processing. But those explanations really reduce down bodily interactions into sensory motor simulation. So it is considered by some as weak embodied cognition. And then we have the radical embodied cognition approaches like enactivism, where the effort is to provide a representation-free explanation for cognition, focusing on, assemblies of the environment, the body and the mind, brain, and these assemblies are transit and they dynamically emerge. So one problem, even though I really like enactivism, one issue that I have is how do you do cognitive science or cognitive neuroscience from an enactivist perspective? It's really hard to even think of setting up an experiment. So this is a discussion that I hope will emerge perhaps in numerical cognition. Can we do enactivist numerical cognition research? And I think one issue is the idea with enactivism is that you don't reduce everything down to processes in the brain. You actually look at both bodily structure and bodily interactions and the environment as well. And when we do experiments, we tend to reduce things down to cognitive processes. And even when we collect bodily data, for example, in the finger math research, when we collect counting data, we actually have these structured protocols where we collect counting data, which I think sometimes biases subjects towards providing certain type of data. All right, so, and I'm just thinking of a roadmap. I mean, this is something that I want to apply in my future research. And the idea is this first, to develop some standardized finger-based measures. So, I've done studies on finger noses. When you look at the literature, you have 5 different ways of doing a finger noses task, right? So in one protocol, you move the matching finger on the other hand, and in one of them, you show the finger that was touched with the index finger of the other hand. And then there is one where you actually vocalize which finger was touched. And all of these, protocols, they actually measure different things. So when you look at the literature on finger noses, and make comparisons, you are actually comparing different things. So they are not exactly the same protocol. So I think one thing that we need is to have standardized protocols so that we can do these comparisons to understand really, to explain these conflicting results sometimes we see. And inclusion of finger sensory motor system in neural models based on the data that we have, maybe should be considered because our models are very cognitivist, and it doesn't include really the sensory motor system in relation to bodily interactions or bodily skills. And obviously we need more research, particularly I think neuroimaging research to kind of really understand the function of the sensory motor system in number processing in the brain. And in terms of the new ways of doing research, based on this discussion of like how can we do embedded cognition, how can we apply ideas from embedded cognition, particularly in activism, to research, is for example, the way we measure finger counting maybe sometimes does not account for the individual differences. So when I observe my kids, they do finger counting in so many different creative ways. So one example is on that picture on the right, sorry, where my daughter actually, I saw her like inserting these pencils between her fingers to increase the number of fingers that she has so that she can more easily count, and do arithmetic with larger numbers. I don't remember seeing anything like that in the literature, but I see them doing finger counting all kinds of ways that change depending on the context. And when I collect finger counting data myself, I collected once, and I assume that that child does finger counting or monitoring. the same way, right? Every time. And there's also, we don't have much emphasis on phenomenology, the first person experience, while we are doing numerical cognition. I think this can also be related to the bodily interactions, because actually when you talk to children, they report on how they use their bodies to do numerical cognition. And I'm particularly referring to cognitive neuroscience research here. Of course, there's lots of research where children are interviewed and observed, but not in the context of cognitive neuroscience. And this, when idea in activism is this brain-body environment assembly, soft assembly is emerging during, cognitive tasks. And for that to emerge in the lab, it needs to be a more kind of contextualized and dynamic environment than a typical lab study. But of course, there are restrictions that come with neuroimaging methods, but maybe it would be good to start a discussion on how we can have more contextualized kind of authentic tasks in the context of neuroimaging studies. Yep.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much, Firat.
Thank you.
So whoever has time to stick around a bit, please feel free. Otherwise, thanks for coming. See you next time. We've got one question from Christoph. Please go ahead. Or one.
Yeah. So yeah, it was more meant like a comment. We had one study actually where we asked like educated adults just to count with their fingers twice, and actually the consistency was really far from perfect, to be fair. And we only looked more or less whether they started with right hand or with left hand. And yeah, this was below the expectation. But on the other hand, the good thing was that they claim that those who claimed that they are quite consistent, because we also asked about it, actually were a little bit more consistent than those who just told that, well, it doesn't care for me whether I start with left hand or right hand or so.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That also shows like self-report can be, if it's not perfectly reliable, it can be to some extent reliable. I think that's really interesting. And I mean, it might be even more varied with children, right? I mean, with adults, you would expect it to converge more than children. Maybe we'll see even further variance in children.
Yeah, if anyone likes, I put the link to this paper in the chat.
Yeah, thank you.
So are there any more questions, comments, either to Firat's talk or generally also to the other speakers, if something came up?
I have a further question to Firat, if I may. Specifically, you said, so first of all, very, very nice talk, and I think we share a lot of interests. You said there are some protocols that bias subjects to certain kinds of data. So apparently, you could illustrate what we should not do. Do you have an example of what should not be done in order to avoid biased results?
Yeah, so, I think one example that we, an issue that we kind of faced with in the lab was we wanted to collect monitoring data. So we showed people pictures of apples and asked them to indicate how many apples are shown. I mean, so there we realized that the way they sit, for example, so before we get into this task, we asked them to fill the consent form, and then they turn and then face the experimenter, right? And they often like put their hands like this because the experimenter is sitting there, so they're more likely to put their hand on the or their arm on the table. I mean, we realized like this might be actually influencing that, because if you're resting your arm on the table, then you are using the other maybe hands. It might be biasing. I mean, this is kind of a simple example, but
it's a good example. I agree, because of the communicative function of the gesture itself. Yes. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, even like the hand, the person showing, holding to like pictures of the apples might be actually influencing. It might maybe get influencing on the person. I think the point is like these things should emerge in like kind of more natural interactions, but you have time limitations in the lab, and you need to get that measure like in a minute or 2 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, this is a lesson I learned a while ago. I was one of the people making that mistake, and there is a very nice sort of proposal for how to do assessment of finger counting, whether you start on the left or right hand, by Thévenot and Lucidi, or Lucidi and Thévenot, where the finger counting is never actually mentioned, but people are told to count the number of syllables in a sentence. Mm-hmm. So since they are stating the sentence, they have no other way of counting unless they use their fingers spontaneously. And that's one example of a procedure that I think could become such an agreed standard in the field. But I also appreciate your proposal that there should be more of this agreement to further collaborations.
Sure, yeah, I'm actually familiar with the protocol and we use it in the lab. Like, and that was really nice because I think it was used also in a replication study, if I'm not mistaken. But like for monitoring, for example, we don't have that, so you kind of have to make it up. I mean, monitoring is a new concept anyway, but relatively new.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So any other questions or comments?
Actually, like you told that it would be good to have like big data on this, and then actually we were using this procedure that Martin mentioned a moment ago in the multi-lab replication of the attentional snark thing, and then we tested like over 1,000 participants, and this data should be around in the OSF profiles associated to this multi-lab paper. So. Like if you like such kind of data, it could be like a good point to start with.
Fantastic, yeah. Thanks for letting me know. I didn't know that you finished collecting the data, and it was, I knew that when you were collecting, I was aware of that, but I didn't know that it was published. So yeah, thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, it's published. I can also post the link to this paper if you like.
So. Anything else? If not, then thank you very much. Also, thank you for staying a little bit longer. Really enjoyed this session. Yeah, and then I guess see at least some of you next week on Thursday. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Great symposium.
Thanks, everyone.